Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this like clear expectation of precision, you know? It's almost like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film and says, well, there it is.
Right, it's totally binary, broken or not broken. You slap a cast on it, you wait 6 weeks, and the bone just knits back together.
Exactly. Fracture is visible, it's categorized, and there's a very specific, well-documented protocol for how to fix it. But when you step out of the realm of physical medicine and into the world of sociology, of national identity, and geopolitical ideology, suddenly that x-ray machine just stops working so cleanly.
Yeah, the image gets incredibly blurry.
Right. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky, and the source material you've shared with us today attempts to read that really muddy x-ray. It's a highly detailed, deeply analytical Arabic text examining what the author explicitly terms the crisis of Zionism.
And, the central question driving this entire text is really one of structural integrity. It's asking, what happens when a foundational revolutionary ideology, an ideology that was forged in the fires of intense crisis and an absolute need for survival, collides head-on with the modern realities of consumerism?
Yeah, the shifting demographics and just the simple, universal human desire to live a comfortable life.
Exactly. That collision is the core theme of our deep dive today.
We're going to unpack the structural, societal, and psychological crises detailed in this text for you, the listener. Our mission here is to understand the mechanisms behind the author's argument. We want to know why they argue this specific ideology is facing a profound, inescapable internal breakdown.
But before we delve into the actual mechanics of this argument, it's really necessary to establish the parameters of our analysis. The source material provided contains heavily politically charged analysis.
Absolutely.
It uses highly specific and sometimes provocative terminology, and it presents a very distinct viewpoint on a conflict that is, recognized globally as one of the most contentious in modern history.
Yeah, and just to be absolutely clear on our role here, we are not endorsing the viewpoints presented in the text. We aren't taking sides, nor are we validating the author's conclusions as absolute truth.
Right. Our job is strictly analytical.
Exactly. We're going to impartially report, decode, and analyze the arguments, the historical interpretations, and the metaphors exactly as they are presented in your source material. We're just here to translate the underlying logic of the author's argument so you can understand the architecture of their critique.
And the author is positing a framework where the crisis is not primarily external. It's not fundamentally about border disputes or foreign armies. The argument is that the crisis is internal, it's structural, and has been woven into the very fabric of the ideology since the late 19th century.
As I was reading through the translation of the source, I kept trying to find a modern parallel to explain the structural tension, and I kept coming back to the life cycle of a startup company.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to frame it.
Right. Think of a revolutionary nation-building ideology like a tech startup in its absolute infancy. When a startup launches, it operates in founder mode. The entire team is pulling all-nighters, they're sleeping under their desks, eating instant ramen. The mission is everything, and mere survival is literally the only metric of success.
Yeah, it's an intensely focused, ascetic environment.
Exactly, and that hypervigilance works perfectly for getting the company off the ground.
The problem, of course, is that you just cannot run an organization in founder mode indefinitely. Human beings simply can't sustain that level of asceticism and crisis-driven adrenaline for 50 or 100 years.
Precisely. Eventually, if the startup is successful, it goes public. It transforms into a massive, profitable corporation, and suddenly the employees do not want to sleep under their desks anymore.
No, they want a robust 401k match.
Right. They want comprehensive dental insurance. They want to clock out at 5 p.m. on a Friday and take their boat to the lake. The intense, sacrificial drive that built the company becomes entirely at odds with the sustainable, long-term corporate culture required to maintain a modern, comfortable life.
And according to the logic of the text we're analyzing, that is the exact structural crisis we're looking at. The author argues that the original iteration of this ideology was built entirely on a foundation of hardship, manual agricultural labor, and an acceptance of constant military readiness.
But human populations naturally and inevitably gravitate toward comfort and security.
Exactly. So the diagnostic question becomes, what happens when the citizens simply want to enjoy the fruits of a modern, westernized economy,
Right.
but the state, due to its geopolitical positioning and foundational goals, still demands that they live in that hypervigilant founder mode?
The text argues it creates a massive psychological and societal rift. But before the author dissects that internal fracture, they insist that we first have to look at the perimeter walls.
Right, the external defenses.
Yeah, we have to examine how the state attempts to secure itself from external annihilation. The author sets up a deliberate, stark contrast between an outward projection of ultimate military invincibility and an inward reality of profound societal vulnerability.
And the text begins this architectural breakdown by focusing on the ultimate external shield. The author analyzes the state's nuclear dimension, specifically filtering it through what is strategically known as the Begin Doctrine.
Now, this is named after the former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, correct?
Yes, that's right. The Begin Doctrine operates as a non-negotiable strategic imperative. It essentially dictates that the state must take proactive, preemptive military action to prevent any of its Middle Eastern neighbors from acquiring nuclear weapons or advanced weapons-grade nuclear technology.
Okay, I see.
The author points to the 1981 military strike, where fighter jets bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak as the foundational textbook application of this doctrine.
I just want to make sure we understand the strategic calculus here, because it isn't just about maintaining a conventional military edge, like having more tanks or better fighter jets. It's a doctrine that says no adversary is even allowed to enter the arena of unconventional warfare.
That is the core of it, yeah. But the author's analysis goes much deeper into the actual function of this nuclear dimension. The text posits a fascinating reality. The nuclear option is not actually integrated into standard day-to-day military strategy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it isn't designed to be deployed on a battlefield to win a conventional war or push back a border incursion. Instead, it exists as an entirely independent security umbrella. It's a strategic reserve designed for one singular purpose: to guarantee absolute survival in the most extreme apocalyptic scenarios imaginable.
So we are talking about a true doomsday scenario, a situation where the conventional military defenses have completely collapsed, the borders are breached, and the state is facing the literal, immediate threat of total annihilation.
Exactly. It is the absolute weapon of last resort, locked away in the deepest vault. But this creates a paradox, which the author eagerly explores.
What kind of paradox?
Well, if you possess a weapon of unimaginable power, but the threshold for using it is so astronomically high that it can practically never be deployed in any recognizable modern conflict, what is its actual utility? How does a doomsday weapon help a state navigate like a Tuesday afternoon diplomatic dispute?
That is the crucial question. If you can't use it, how does it function as an umbrella?
According to the text, its primary utility transforms from the military to the political and psychological. The author argues that the state utilizes a strategy of deliberate, calculated opacity, often referred to as a veil of ambiguity.
Ah, the strategy of never officially confirming but also never definitively denying the existence or the scale of the nuclear arsenal.
Precisely. By maintaining this veil of ambiguity, the state projects a constant low-frequency hum of psychological pressure across the entire Middle East. It forces neighboring Arab states to factor a completely unpredictable doomsday scenario into every single diplomatic, economic, and conventional military calculation they make.
Wow.
Yeah, it creates a psychological ceiling on how far any adversary is willing to push a conflict. But the text extrapolates further, arguing that this veil of ambiguity serves a secondary, perhaps even more critical function globally. The author asserts it is used as massive diplomatic leverage, particularly in its relationship with the United States.
Let me see if I can trace the author's logic here. Are they suggesting that the implied threat of the nuclear arsenal is actually aimed diplomatically at their allies?
It is a really nuanced form of geopolitical extraction, according to the source. The logic, as interpreted by the author, essentially boils down to this: the state implicitly communicates to the global superpower, hey, we possess the capability to initiate a regional, or perhaps even global, unconventional catastrophe if our absolute survival is threatened.
Okay.
Therefore, it is in your vital national security interest to provide us with the overwhelming conventional weapons, the advanced defense systems, and the billions of dollars in economic backing we need to decisively win conventional conflicts. That way, we are never, ever backed into a corner where we feel compelled to open that final vault.
That is a staggering interpretation of international relations. The umbrella isn't just shielding them from rain, it's being used to demand that an ally build a massive conventional roof over their heads just to ensure the umbrella never has to be open.
That is exactly the dynamic the author is describing. It becomes an instrument to guarantee a continuous flow of conventional superiority.
But if we follow that logic, it brings up a massive, glaring contradiction in the text's own premise. If a state has successfully built this architecture, if it possesses the ultimate existential security umbrella, and has successfully leveraged that to secure practically unconditional military and economic backing from the world's sole superpower, shouldn't that state feel entirely, unquestionably secure?
You would think so, yes.
Right. Structurally speaking, they have constructed the ultimate fortress. So why does the author spend the rest of the text arguing that the state is on the verge of a profound crisis?
Because, as the author meticulously details, a fortress, no matter how thick its walls or how advanced its perimeter defenses, only protects you from what is outside. The central thesis of your source material is that the true crisis is internal. The author asserts that this structural instability didn't begin with the geopolitical conflicts of the late 20th century.
When did it begin then?
It began in 1882 with the earliest waves of ideological settlement. The contradictions are baked into the very DNA of the movement.
So the author is arguing that the formal creation of the state apparatus in 1948 didn't actually resolve the foundational crisis of the ideology.
The text argues that the creation of the state merely masked the crisis. In fact, by forcing a theoretical utopian ideology to suddenly confront the hard, unyielding bureaucratic realities of governing a diverse population, statehood might have actually exacerbated the internal fractures.
That makes sense.
Yeah, the external weapons, the nuclear ambiguity, the billions in foreign aid. The author insists that absolutely none of these external tools are capable of fixing the internal contradictions of who the citizens actually are, what they fundamentally believe, and how they manage to coexist within those fortress walls.
Which transitions us from the perimeter defenses to the internal load-bearing walls. We're moving from the external nuclear umbrella to the internal societal fault lines. And the author points out that the most immediate volatile threat to the society's cohesion might not be external armies at all, but rather its own deeply conflicted definition of religion, secularism, and identity.
To understand the mechanics of this internal fracture, the text provides a detailed demographic breakdown regarding religious identity, and the numbers are incredibly telling. According to the source's data, approximately 60% of the Jewish population identifies as Haloni, which translates directly to secular.
60%, that is not a marginal group. That is a massive, dominant majority.
It is the statistical core of the state. Then, the text notes that about 30% identify as Masorti, which translates to traditional or conservative. And only a small, highly fractionated minority identifies as deeply orthodox or ultra-orthodox, referred to as the deity or herdim.
So if we look purely at the data, we're analyzing a predominantly secular modern society. But the text introduces this theoretical concept called comprehensive secularism. And the mechanics of how the author describes this concept are fascinating because it exposes a massive historical paradox.
It is arguably one of the most intellectually provocative arguments in the entire text. The author forces the reader to look back at the early founders of the movement, the pioneers and intellectuals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right.
These individuals were largely European. They were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, by nationalism, and by socialism.
Right.
The vast majority of them were either staunch atheists or deeply philosophically secular.
Their goal was a radical reinvention of identity, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The text argues that their explicit goal was to strip Judaism of its religious theology, its rabbinical authority, and what they perceived as a passive, wait-for-the-Messiah mentality that had developed over centuries in the diaspora.
They want to modernize it.
Yeah, they wanted to transform a religious community into a modern, assertive, ethnic national identity. They wanted to build a secular nation-state operating on the exact same geopolitical logic as the French, the Italians, or the Germans.
They want it to be a normal nation. But here is the paradox the text highlights, and it's a massive logical knot. These inherently atheistic founders, who actively rejected religious dogma and divine revelation, paradoxically utilized the central religious text, the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, as the absolute foundational justification for their territorial claims in the Middle East.
The text underscores this cognitive dissonance repeatedly. You have a movement fundamentally driven by secular nationalism, yet it leans on a divine covenant to legitimize its geographic borders to the international community.
You're wild.
The founders, throughout the theology, they threw out the daily religious observance, but they kept the real estate deed explicitly detailed in the religious text.
The author provides examples of early secular leaders quoting biblical promises of land, despite publicly stating they didn't believe in the God who allegedly made those promises. They harnessed the absolute, unquestionable authority of a divine mandate to legitimize a purely secular, modern political project.
Right.
And the author argues that this foundational hypocrisy created comprehensive secularism, a society that has essentially hollowed out the religion from the inside, leaving only the external shell to be worn whenever it is politically or territorially convenient.
And the text meticulously traces how this foundational paradox creates a deeply confusing, often contradictory daily reality for the average citizen today. The author spends a significant amount of time analyzing the Masorti, that 30% who identify as traditional. Their behavior, according to the text, perfectly illustrates the friction of comprehensive secularism.
The source provides very specific, grounded examples of this, doesn't it? It observes that a Masorti family might diligently light Sabbath candles on a Friday evening. If you ask why, the text suggests it isn't necessarily out of a deep fear of divine retribution. It's just a beautiful, romantic, low-cost ritual.
Yeah, exactly.
It connects them to a historical lineage and a cultural heritage without demanding any severe disruption to their modern lifestyle.
But the author immediately points out the flip side of that coin. That exact same family who just lit the sacred candles will wake up the next morning and happily drive their car to the beach, go to the cinema, or eat non-kosher food actions that are strictly forbidden under the actual religious laws they ostensibly honored the night before.
The statistics the author includes regarding dietary laws are a perfect encapsulation of this. The text cites reports suggesting that up to half of the meat consumed within the state is pork.
Pork being, of course, the ultimate, universally recognized taboo in strict Jewish dietary law.
Right. But while half the meat consumed might be pork, the author notes that surveys show only about 27% of the population will actually admit to eating it.
It's a statistical manifestation of cognitive dissonance. People are living entirely secular, consumer-driven lives, but they feel a societal or psychological pressure to maintain the illusion of traditional religious adherence.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The text uses this to hammer home its thesis. The society is fundamentally secular, deeply westernized, and heavily consumerist, and therefore it's inherently at odds with the rigid religious branding it uses to legitimize its existence. The author even points to extreme examples of secularization, noting the presence of the adult entertainment industry, pornography, and prostitution operating in urban centers, sometimes uncomfortably close to sites considered globally sacred.
The author uses these examples not to make a moral judgment on pornography, but to prove a structural point. You cannot claim a state is divinely mandated and religiously pure when its citizens are living like standard secular Europeans. And this friction leads us directly into what the text describes as the status quo trap.
Right, because the secular founders in 1948 weren't entirely blind.
No, they knew they had a massive internal problem. They had a tiny vocal minority of deeply Orthodox Jews who believed that establishing a secular state before the arrival of the Messiah was essentially a blasphemous rebellion against God.
To prevent this Orthodox minority from revolting, or worse, from traveling to the United Nations and actively undermining the nascent state's fragile legitimacy on the global stage, the secular leadership had to make a political compromise. They brokered a deal.
The famous 1947 status quo agreement. As I was reading the author's breakdown of this historical moment, it felt exactly like a group of college students signing a desperate, temporary lease with a deeply difficult roommate, only to realize decades later that the temporary lease had accidentally become the permanent, unbreakable constitution of the house.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the author's analysis. In 1947, secular leaders, aiming for immediate political stability, essentially handed over complete jurisdiction of personal familial life to the Orthodox rabbinate.
They gave them so much power.
They really did. They gave this strict religious minority a legal monopoly over marriage, over divorce, over conversions, over burials, and over the enforcement of dietary laws in all public institutions and the military. Furthermore, and perhaps most consequentially, they granted military draft exemptions to Orthodox yeshiva students, allowing them to study religious texts full-time instead of serving in the armed forces.
We have to look at the historical context the author provides to understand why the secular founders agreed to this. In 1948, how many of these yeshiva students were actually claiming this exemption? The text notes it was roughly 400 individuals.
Exactly. The secular leadership, pragmatic, modern socialist looked at those 400 students and made a demographic calculation. They assumed the ultra-Orthodox were a historical relic, a dying breed that had miraculously survived the Holocaust but would inevitably be assimilated.
Right.
They thought, fine, Let these 400 study. Let them have their enclave. In a generation or two, the sheer gravity of our modern, enlightened, prosperous secular state will absorb their children. The problem will just solve itself.
But the text emphasizes that history, and specifically demographics, did not cooperate with the founders' assumptions. The problem didn't solve itself, it multiplied. By 1997, the text points out that number of exempted students hadn't shrunk. It had exploded from 400 to over 29,000.
And that number represents an entirely separate society operating within the state. Because of the draft exemptions and the reliance on state welfare to support full-time religious study, coupled with exceptionally high birth rates in the ultra-Orthodox communities, you have a massive, rapidly expanding demographic bloc that operates under completely different rules than the secular majority.
How does the author see this playing out in the daily life of the state today? What's the main friction point?
The author describes it as a slow-motion societal rupture. The text details how the secular majority, the 60% who work the jobs, drive the modern economy, pay the bulk of the taxes, and crucially, serve their mandatory years in the military, increasingly view the ultra-Orthodox through a lens of deep resentment. The author notes that secular citizens increasingly refer to the ultra-Orthodox using highly charged terminology, specifically the word parasites.
Wow. The author explicitly pauses to note the grim historical irony of that specific word, right? Parasite is a term carrying incredibly dark, traumatic historical baggage for the Jewish people in Europe, and now, according to the text, it is being weaponized internally by secular Jews against religious Jews over taxation and military service.
It is a devastating linguistic indicator of the depth of the crisis. You have a massive segment of the population that refuses to serve in the military, relies heavily on state welfare subsidized by secular labor, and yet because of that 1947 status quo agreement, this exact same minority holds an absolute unbreakable legal monopoly over how the secular taxpayers are allowed to conduct their most intimate life events.
The text provides some harrowing examples of how this bureaucratic monopoly operates. It mentions a Soviet immigrant who served in the state's military and was killed in a terrorist attack. But because the Orthodox rabbinate, utilizing its strict, archaic criteria, didn't deem him technically Jewish enough, he was barred from being buried in the standard Jewish military cemetery alongside his fallen comrades.
The source also cites instances where bodies were actually exhumed from cemeteries years after burial because retroactive doubts were raised about the purity of their maternal lineage according to Orthodox law.
That's unbelievable. If I'm a secular citizen, paying taxes and serving in the army, and the state allows a religious authority I don't even believe in to dig up my relative's grave over a bureaucratic technicality, the social contract is completely broken.
Which forces the core question the author wants the reader to confront. How can a nation-state sustainably survive when its citizens fundamentally despise each other's way of life? The text doesn't view this as mere political polarization. It cites public opinion polls indicating that nearly half the population harbors a genuine fear of an actual violent civil war erupting between the secular and religious factions.
And if these factions can't agree on the basic rules of how to live together, it's inevitable that they will clash over the most fundamental, existential question of all, the question that defines the very borders of the community. This leads us into the next major structural fracture the author identifies: the identity crisis and the specific question, who is a Jew?
On the surface, who is a Jew sounds like a philosophical debate, or perhaps a purely theological discussion for scholars. But the author makes it abundantly clear that within the framework of a state that legally defines its entire reason for being as the exclusive state of the Jewish people, this question is not philosophical.
It's practical.
Yes, it is a hard, unyielding geopolitical and legal mechanism. It determines citizenship, it determines rights, and it determines immigration policy.
Because if your state's singular purpose is to act as a haven, you must have an incredibly precise definition of who is permitted to walk through the doors of that haven. But the text claims the state is essentially paralyzed by its inability to answer this question.
The paralysis stems directly from that status quo monopoly we just discussed. Because the state delegated personal status to the Orthodox rabbinate, the rabbinate's exceptionally rigid historical interpretation is the only one legally recognized. They flatly refuse to recognize conversions, marriages, or the religious authority of the reform or conservative movements of Judaism.
Let's follow the author's logic on the ripple effects of that refusal. What happens when you invalidate reform and conservative Judaism?
The text points out that you effectively alienate up to 80% of the entire diaspora Jewish population. This is particularly acute in the United States, where the vast, overwhelming majority of the Jewish population belongs to the Reform or conservative branches, or is entirely secular.
The author leans into the profound irony of the situation. The state constantly appeals to world Jewry for political lobbying power, for diplomatic cover, and for massive financial donations. Yet simultaneously, the official, state-sanctioned religious institutions of that same state legally view the religious practices of the vast majority of those donors as completely invalid and in some cases not even authentically Jewish.
It is a structural contradiction that constantly strains the relationship between the center and the diaspora. But the author's analysis of the identity crisis does not stop at religious denomination.
Right, there's the ethnic divide too.
Exactly. The text dives incredibly deeply into an internal ethnic divide. The author details the construction of what they call a rigid ethnic pyramid.
This part of the text is critical because I think a lot of people looking at the society from the outside assume a relatively monolithic demographic. They assume a unified population. But the author dissects a highly stratified, racially and culturally divided society.
The historical context the author provides here is vital. The text argues that early foundational Zionism essentially equated the concept of being Jewish with being Ashkenazi, meaning white European Jews. The founders, the intellectuals who wrote the manifestos, the socialists who built their early kibbutzim, the military generals, they were almost exclusively Ashkenazi. Their cultural touchstones were European.
But after they successfully established the state, they faced a stark logistical reality. They had the land, they had the political structure, but they didn't have enough bodies.
They needed workers.
Right. They needed a massive working class to build the physical infrastructure, to lay the roads, to farm the fields, and to populate the vulnerable border towns.
And this is where the demographic engineering occurs. The text explains that the Ashkenazi establishment looked toward the Oriental and Sephardic Jewish populations living across Arab and Islamic lands communities in Yemen, Iraq, Morocco, Egypt. The author asserts that these populations were intentionally brought in to form the broad base of an inverted pyramid. They were geographically and economically directed to become the cheap manual labor force, ensuring that the European Ashkenazim could maintain their tight, unchallenged grip on political, military, and economic power.
The text is unsparing in its assessment of how this dynamic played out. It argues that upon arrival, these Oriental Jews were placed in harsh transit camps. More profoundly, the author claims the Ashkenazi elite deliberately attempted to strip these populations of their Arab cultural heritage.
Yeah, their language, their music, their traditions were viewed as backward or inherently hostile because they resembled the culture of the enemy.
The text argues they were marginalized, systematically placed on the social ladder, just one precarious step above the local Palestinian Arabs.
And this is where the author introduces a truly profound psychological analysis. If you're a sociologist observing this dynamic, you have to ask a logical question. How do these Oriental Sephardic Jews react to this intense marginalization by the European elite? Do they look at the local Arab population, recognize that they share a deep cultural affinity, similar food, similar music, and historically the same language, and decide to form a political or cultural alliance against the European establishment?
If you assume humans act purely on shared cultural roots, you would absolutely expect them to build a bridge. But the text argues the exact opposite occurs. The marginalization doesn't create solidarity, it forces a radical, tragic overcompensation.
Precisely. The author analyzes the psychological burden placed on the Oriental Jews.
Yeah.
To prove their absolute loyalty to the white Ashkenazi-dominated state and to definitively, aggressively distance themselves from their own Arab cultural roots, which are actively despised by the elite, they adopt ultra-hawkish, extreme, right-wing political stances against the Arabs.
The text refers to them as doves trying to be hawks. It's a brutal psychological loop. In order to be accepted by the very elite that actively oppresses and marginalizes them economically, they have to fiercely hate the population that they most closely resemble culturally.
They must constantly perform their hostility to prove they belong to the nation. But the author points out the ultimate cynical irony of this dynamic. Because the Oriental Jews adopt these ultra-hardline, uncompromising political stances, the Ashkenazi political and diplomatic elite turn around and use that exact extremism to justify keeping them out of power.
Wait, how do they justify that?
The elite argue, well, we can't put these individuals in high-level diplomatic or leadership roles. They're too extreme, they're too emotional, they're incapable of the nuanced negotiation required for statecraft.
Wow, so I can deduce the author's point here. It creates a perfectly sealed, self-fulfilling prophecy. The Ashkenazi elite ensures they remain the sole voice of reason and power, while the Oriental Jews remain locked in a perpetual cycle of performative hostility just to maintain their citizenship status, forever serving as the hawkish base of the pyramid.
It's a masterful, if deeply cynical, mechanism of social control, according to the text. It ensures internal political dominance while permanently fracturing the society along ethnic lines.
This internal friction, the rigid religious gatekeeping that alienates the diaspora, combined with the systemic ethnic tension that alienates half the internal population, leads directly to a harsh, inescapable mathematical reality. This brings us to the author's analysis of the demographic dilemma.
To understand the demographic crisis, we must look at the foundational goal, the absolute core promise of the entire ideological movement. It was centered on a concept known as the ingathering of the exiles. The theological and political promise was that once the sovereign state was officially established, the scattered, persecuted Jewish populations of the world would collectively realize their historic destiny. They would pack their bags, leave the diaspora, and return en masse to populate the homeland.
It was supposed to be a magnetic pull that no one could resist. But as the author bluntly points out, they didn't come.
They unequivocally did not. The text highlights a glaring, uncomfortable statistical reality. The vast majority of the world's Jews chose to stay exactly where they were. They chose to remain in the West, most notably and overwhelmingly in the United States. Furthermore, the global Jewish population outside the state has largely stagnated or is slowly assimilating. The great demographic wave never materialized.
The author is absolutely ruthless in mocking the dynamic that developed instead. The text introduces highly satirical terms like checkbook Zionism and alimony Zionism. Let's break down the mechanics of what the author means by that.
The author is critiquing the relationship that evolved between the sovereign state and the diaspora, particularly American Jews. The text views this relationship as fundamentally hypocritical. Diaspora Jews might feel a lingering sense of historical guilt or a desire to maintain a cultural or religious connection to the homeland.
So they donate money.
Exactly. So they write a check. They donate to planting trees, they fund hospitals, they lobby their local politicians. But according to the author's analysis, these diaspora Jews have absolutely zero intention of actually leaving their comfortable, secure, highly prosperous lives in New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles to immigrate to a volatile conflict zone in the Middle East.
The metaphors the author deploys here are incredibly sharp. They read almost like dark stand-up comedy. The text suggests that U.S. Jews treat the state less like a homeland and more like a Jewish Disneyland. It's a curated theme park that you visit for 2 weeks in the summer to feel a rush of historical pride and ethnic connection, and then you safely fly back to your actual life in the suburbs.
The text also uses the metaphor of a luxury hotel. The author notes that wealthy diaspora Jews visit during the pleasant spring weather, but they leave the locals, the actual working-class citizens, to do the heavy lifting, to serve in the military, to fight the wars, and to do the grueling maintenance of the state during the harsh, violent winters.
The text even includes a joke about the Jewish state of New York. It's a play on the idea that if you look at where the true center of Jewish prosperity, physical security, and cultural influence actually resides, it isn't in the Middle East at all. It's in North America.
Yeah.
And then the author delivers the darkest punchline of all regarding this demographic failure. The text claims that some American Jews are so deeply ideologically dedicated to the cause of returning to the homeland that they finally make the ultimate sacrifice and immigrate, but only in wooden coffins, demanding to be flown over just to be buried in the holy soil, having entirely avoided living on it.
While the author uses dark humor, the underlying analytical point is severe. It points to a profound structural failure. If a nationalist ideology fundamentally relies on continuous demographic growth to maintain physical hold over contested territory, but the target population explicitly refuses to immigrate, the entire colonial or national project inevitably stalls. It becomes a fortress without enough soldiers to man the walls.
But if I'm reading the author's data correctly, the problem is actually compounding. It isn't just that new people are refusing to immigrate, it's that the people who are already inside the fortress are actively trying to leave.
Yes, the text places significant emphasis on the phenomenon known as yorida. In Hebrew, aliyah means ascent, representing the ideological high ground of immigrating to the state. Yorida, conversely, literally translates to descent, the act of leaving the state to live elsewhere.
Oh, I see.
The author highlights that hundreds of thousands of native-born citizens, and crucially, often the most highly educated, the secular, the technically skilled, the elite of the society, are quietly packing up their lives and descending. They're moving to Berlin, to London, to Silicon Valley.
If we look at this through the lens of the startup analogy, why are the core employees quitting? If this state is the realized dream of 2,000 years of longing and they were born into it, why are they walking away?
The author attributes it to profound systemic exhaustion. The text argues that these citizens are deeply drained by the endless repetitive cycle of military conflict. They're exhausted by the mandatory multi-year military service that disrupts their youth. They're tired of the exorbitant tax rates required to fund the defense budget and the welfare state of the ultra-Orthodox.
And the religious coercion?
And they are suffocated by the religious coercion we discussed regarding the rabbinate. They simply want normalcy.
They want the corporate benefits. They want to clock out.
Exactly. They want economic mobility and peace. They want to be the successful startup employees who finally get to go to the lake on the weekend. But the state, due to its unresolved geopolitical situation, is permanently demanding they keep sleeping under the desk. So they hand in their resignation and leave the country.
If the smartest, most mobile, secular citizens are leaving, we have to deduce what happens to the culture of the society that remains behind. How does the internal engine of the state mutate? The text describes this transition as moving from plows to Porsches, culminating in what the author terms air-conditioned Zionism.
This specific section of the source test serves as a broad sociological critique of late-stage capitalism colliding with nationalist ideology. The author argues that the original animating ideological fervor, the romanticized vision of the ascetic, socialist pioneer who drains the malarial swamps, lives in a collective and works the harsh land with his own two hands, is completely, irrevocably dead.
So the old ideal is gone.
Completely. The foundational economic ideal of Hebrew labor, the idea that the nation must be built exclusively by Jewish hands to be pure, has been entirely abandoned.
If the ascetic pioneer is dead, what archetype has replaced him? What fills the cultural vacuum?
The text asserts the vacuum was rapidly filled by aggressive Western consumerism, intense Americanization, and a relentless drive toward economic privatization. The author introduces a colloquial Hebrew slang term to define this new archetype, Rosh Katan, which translates to small head.
Small head, big stomach.
That is the perfect encapsulation. The Rosh Katan is the author's view of the modern degraded citizen. This is an individual who actively shirks communal responsibility. They refuse to think about the grand historical narrative of the nation. They're entirely disconnected from the collective good.
They just care about themselves.
Exactly. Their worldview has shrunk to encompass only their personal consumption, their acquisition of luxury goods, and their immediate individual gratification.
The author notes how this completely flips the original economic model on its head. The early pioneers, driven by ideology, insisted on doing every single job themselves, from the lowest, most grueling manual labor in the fields to the highest levels of management. But now, driven by the big stomach of consumerism, the state has outsourced the hardship.
Right.
They rely heavily on cheap Palestinian Arab labor and increasingly on imported foreign migrant workers from Asia and Eastern Europe to do all the construction, all the agriculture, and all the menial service work.
And it is here that the author points out a devastating cyclical historical irony. By universally refusing to engage in physical, manual labor, and by transitioning the entire citizen population into managers, middlemen, white-collar professionals, and tech entrepreneurs, the modern state has unwittingly recreated the exact socioeconomic demographic profile of the European exile.
Wow.
This was the very profile that the early Zionist founders were desperately trying to escape, cure, and transcend through physical labor.
That is a staggering sociological observation. You engineer a massive historical migration to a new state specifically to escape a stereotype of being unrooted middlemen. And within 3 generations, the sheer force of modern consumerism drives your society right back into that exact same economic structure. The text uses the evolution of the kibbutzim as the ultimate proof of this ideological collapse.
The kibbutz was the undisputed heart of the socialist agricultural dream. It was the absolute vanguard of the ideology. But the text observes the reality of the modern kibbutzim. They are leasing out their agricultural land, they are hiring cheap foreign labor to pick their crops, and the kibbutz members themselves are sitting in air-conditioned offices aggressively playing the global stock market.
That's a huge shift.
They've transitioned from ideological collectives into standard, profit-driven agricultural corporations.
And what are the individual citizens striving for? The text distills the modern dream into the 3 V's: Volvo, video, and villa. That is the new horizon of ambition.
And the author makes a critical connection here. This overwhelming consumer desire for the villa directly drives what the text calls deluxe Zionism, particularly regarding the phenomenon of shuttle settlements.
We need to analyze this concept carefully because it entirely reframes the standard international narrative. Usually, when the global media reports on the expansion of settlements in contested territories like the West Bank, the assumption is that every single person moving there is a religious zealot, driven by a divine mandate to reclaim Holy Land.
While the author acknowledges that religious zealots certainly exist, and they form a crucial part of the final analysis we'll discuss, the text argues that a massive, often overlooked portion of the settlement expansion is driven entirely by mundane real estate economics, not theology.
This is deluxe Zionism. The author argues that tens of thousands of people are not moving to these contested territories out of a burning ideological zeal. They're moving there because the government heavily subsidizes the housing and infrastructure.
Yeah, they just want a nice house.
Exactly. These citizens want a cheap, luxurious, multi-bedroom house with a backyard and a swimming pool, the villa, which they could never possibly afford in the hyperinflated real estate market of a city like Tel Aviv. So they buy the heavily subsidized villa in the occupied territory, and they simply commute back and forth on secure bypass roads to their white-collar tech jobs in the city.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the Rosh Katan. It's suburban sprawl masked as ideological territorial expansion. But the author points out that this creates a massive strategic vulnerability for the state.
How so?
Well, if a citizen is only living on the volatile frontier because they wanted a cheap swimming pool and a two-car garage, how much hardship are they actually willing to endure? When a violent, localized political uprising occurs, do they possess the ideological fortitude to stay and fight, or do they flee because the commute has become inconvenient?
Which naturally brings the author's critique directly to the military. If you've engineered a society whose absolute highest ideal is the acquisition of the Volvo, video, and villa, what happens to the structural integrity of the state when you inevitably have to ask the children of that society to go fight a grueling war?
According to the text, you face a profound systemic military crisis. The author details the rise of what they term Generation MTV. This is a generation of youth raised entirely on American pop culture, individualism, global internet connectivity, and consumerism.
Right.
When this generation looks at the reality of their mandatory military service, which increasingly involves the endless, grinding, morally ambiguous policing of occupied civilian territories rather than heroic battles against foreign armies, they simply don't want to participate.
The text provides mechanisms of how this avoidance plays out, and it goes far beyond a few localized protests. It details a systemic societal effort to dodge the draft. The author notes that youth are increasingly utilizing fake psychological evaluations to secure medical exemptions from combat service.
And the corruption goes all the way up the chain of command. The author highlights massive systemic scandals where high-ranking military officers and official military psychiatrists were caught accepting bribes to write fake exemptions for the wealthy children of the elite, who simply didn't want to disrupt their university studies or career trajectories.
If we return to the startup analogy, when the senior executives are actively taking bribes to let the core workforce go home, the ascetic founder mode is definitively, irreversibly over. The author argues that this exposes a pervasive lack of motivation across the society to fight what the citizens increasingly perceive as wars of choice or wars of political convenience, rather than authentic wars of absolute existential survival.
This forces the author to pivot to the psychological dimension of the crisis. We must ask, what is the psychological toll of living inside this massive contradiction? You have a society that was structurally built on the absolute necessity of constant military readiness, surrounded by perceived hostile enemies, but the population's actual desire is just to go to the shopping mall and watch MTV.
How does the human brain cope with the daily dissonance of living in a heavily armed consumerist bubble?
This leads us into the author's taxonomy of psychological coping mechanisms. How do people react to an endless, unresolvable conflict that interrupts their desire for luxury? The text categorizes the societal responses, moving far beyond the simplistic standard political labels of hawks and doves.
The author introduces a deeply cynical, fascinating psychological taxonomy to describe the reactions of the populace to phenomena like the Palestinian Intifada, the prolonged uprising. The text briefly acknowledges the doves, of course.
The doves are categorized as the intellectuals, the writers, the left-wing academics. The text implies they write very beautiful, highly sympathetic articles in the newspapers, but practically speaking, they hold absolutely zero political power to change the physical reality on the ground. They're a performative conscious.
Exactly. And on the absolutely opposite extreme, the author acknowledges the hawks. These are the hardliners who propose extreme, punitive, and often logistically or ethically impossible measures. Policies like mass deportations or the absolute unrelenting military crushing of any and all dissent, regardless of international law.
But the author isn't terribly interested in the extremes. The text spends its energy dissecting the massive middle ground of the society, which it divides into chickens and ostriches.
Walk me through the mechanics of the chicken.
The chicken is the author's manifestation of deep underlying psychological insecurity masked by aggression. The text uses the evocative image of certain frontier settlers. Politically, they talk an incredibly tough game. They advocate for aggressive territorial expansion, they carry assault rifles to the grocery store, and they project an image of frontier fearlessness.
But there's a catch.
But the author notes that these same individuals are the ones riding in heavily armored, bulletproof buses, physically ducking down to the floorboards when driving past neighboring Arab villages. Their tough, aggressive political exterior is a performance that completely masks a profound, daily, exhausting physical terror.
It's the psychology of living in a state of constant low-level panic while pretending you're the apex predator. But the author reserves the most extensive analysis for the most common societal response, the ostrich.
The ostrich is the ultimate societal-level manifestation of the Rosh Khatan, the small head. Ostriches are the politicians, the military bureaucrats, and the everyday consumerist citizens who completely and intentionally bury their heads in the sand when faced with systemic crisis.
Let's deduce how that actually looks in practice. If a massive political uprising occurs, how does an ostrich react?
The ostrich reacts by fundamentally miscategorizing the nature of the threat. The text argues that the ostrich looks at a massive, deeply rooted, historical and political uprising, a fundamental clash of national identities and territorial claims, and pretends, through sheer force of will, that it's merely a technical or logistical security issue.
So they try to apply an engineering solution to a sociological earthquake?
Exactly. The ostrich deeply believes that if the military can just procure slightly better riot gear, or if they can engineer a new type of non-lethal rubber bullet, or if they can build a slightly taller, more technologically advanced concrete fence, the massive political problem will simply vanish.
That's a huge blind spot.
They obsess over the technical mechanisms of security because acknowledging the root, underlying political causes of the conflict would require them to fundamentally alter their worldview, and it would shatter their comfortable consumerist delusion. They would rather build a better fence than engage in a painful political compromise.
But because an engineering solution can never actually solve a fundamental sociological clash, the conflict never ends, it just changes form. And the author argues that living in this cycle breeds an incredibly dark, existential, fatalistic humor among the populace.
Yeah, the humor is very telling.
The text leans heavily into literary analysis here to demonstrate the psychological burden of what it eloquently calls a barren victory. The state possesses the military might to consistently win the wars, but it completely lacks the structural capacity to ever achieve peace.
The humor becomes a vital, pressure-release coping mechanism for the absurdism of their daily reality.
The text includes a joke that I think perfectly illustrates this societal exhaustion. It's the Moses joke. The premise of the joke is that the entire centuries-long Zionist project is fundamentally based on a tragic geographical misunderstanding.
Oh, I remember this one.
The joke sets the scene with God speaking to Moses, offering him a promised land for his people. Now, Moses, according to biblical tradition, suffered from a stutter. So in the joke, Moses tries to ask God for CCN.
Because Canada represents the ultimate consumerist dream. It's vast, it's incredibly peaceful, it's rich in natural resources, and it shares a border with a massive friendly neighbor.
Exactly. But because of his profound stutter, it comes out as CCN. And so God legally binds them to Canaan, the turbulent, resource-poor, contested Middle East. The text implies that modern, secular citizens are sitting in their cafes, looking around at the desert, the endless wars, the political hostility, and the constant stress, and they're collectively thinking, my God, we could have had Canada.
While it operates as a joke, the author notes how profoundly subversive it is to the state's ideology. It completely undermines the sacred divine historical narrative of the Promised Land and replaces the core ideology with a cosmic, bureaucratic clerical error. It reveals a population that is bone-tired, deeply alienated, and thoroughly exhausted by its own geography.
And the author doesn't stop at jokes. The text delves into much darker psychological territory, pointing to a recurring theme in modern Israeli literature and cinema. the fear of reproduction.
This is perhaps the most chilling diagnostic observation in the author's entire analysis. The text notes specific literary trends where female protagonists experience recurring, vivid nightmares about childbirth. The characters actively, philosophically refuse to have children.
And the text makes it clear this isn't a refusal based on modern career aspirations or economic anxieties about the cost of housing. It's a refusal based entirely on the geopolitical and military reality.
Right.
These characters express that they absolutely refuse to endure the physical pain of childbirth and the immense emotional labor of raising a child for 18 years, only to have the state bureaucracy automatically conscript that child and feed them into the machinery of an endless, unresolvable cyclical war. They flatly refuse to supply the raw biological material, the next generation of soldiers, for a barren victory.
When a society's highest forms of artistic expression and literature begin to reflect a subconscious, collective refusal to biologically reproduce because the future is perceived as inherently, inescapably violent and hopeless, you are no longer looking at a political crisis. You are looking at a profound, terminal structural collapse.
Yeah.
The author's point is clear. The secular, consumerist ideology has entirely, catastrophically failed to provide a compelling, transcendent reason for the populace to endure the hardship required to maintain the state.
If the secular startup logic collapses, if you can no longer justify the endless wars, the mandatory draft, the international isolation, and the constant grinding stress with the promise of a Volvo, video, and villa, what happens next?
Yeah.
A society doesn't just evaporate.
Human psychology abhors a meaning vacuum. If the secular rational framework completely fails to justify the harsh reality of their existence, the population will inevitably, desperately seek out a stronger, more absolute, unyielding framework to make sense of their lives. They need an ideology that makes the suffering meaningful.
And this brings us to the climax of the author's analysis and the final structural component of our deep dive, the rise of what the text calls organic immanentist Zionism. Okay, we need to break down the mechanics of this terminology. What exactly is organic immanentist Zionism?
It sounds like dense, impenetrable academic jargon, but the author uses it to describe a terrifyingly simple, incredibly potent, and highly ascendant political and theological concept. It is a specific, mutated form of Neo-Zionism. It represents the absolute, seamless fusion of extreme territorial nationalism with unyielding, fundamentalist religious absolutism.
How does the author differentiate this new form from the original secular ideology of the founders? How does the logic shift?
We have to look at how the secular founders tried to justify their project to themselves and the world. They utilized logic, universal literalism, European socialism, and arguments based on historical legal rights. But the author argues that those liberal secular frameworks were always doomed to eventually collapse under the weight of their own inherent contradictions. You simply cannot use universal liberal values, which preach equality and human rights, to logically justify displacing another indigenous population or maintaining a decades-long military occupation over millions of disenfranchised people. The cognitive dissonance for a secular liberal becomes too heavy to bear.
I can see the author's logic. You can't successfully claim to be a utopian socialist society that believes in universal human brotherhood while simultaneously enforcing a strict, tiered ethnic hierarchy and military law. The human brain cannot sustain that contradiction without breaking.
Precisely. So to resolve that unbearable psychological dissonance, this new ascendant ideology completely abandons the attempt to use universal logic or liberal values. It shifts entirely toward a divine organic justification. In the framework of organic immanentist Zionism, as the author defines it, the physical dirt of the land, the biological genetics of the people, and the supreme will of God are no longer three separate concepts that interact.
Oh, wow.
They're fused into a single, indivisible, living, sacred entity.
So under this ideology, the soil isn't just contested geopolitical territory, it's biologically divine. The nation isn't just a collection of citizens bound by laws, it's a literal extension of God's will on earth.
Yes. And the author goes to great lengths to explain the terrifying psychological comfort that this extreme ideology provides to its adherents. Think about it. If you're a secular, liberal citizen and your state faces massive international condemnation, United Nations resolutions, and global isolation, you interpret those things as empirical signs that your policies are flawed. You feel geopolitical guilt. You feel immense pressure to negotiate, to compromise, to find a diplomatic off-ramp.
Because your metric for success is acceptance by the international community of nations. But if you fully adopt this organic immanentist worldview, how does the metric change?
The metric entirely inverts. Under this theology, international isolation and universal condemnation are no longer viewed as diplomatic failures to be corrected. They're viewed as divine prophecies being gloriously fulfilled. The text points out how this movement actively quotes and embraces biblical verses that describe them as a people that dwells alone and shall not be reckoned among the nations.
That's fascinating.
In this specific fundamentalist mindset, the empirical fact that the entire world is condemning you is the absolute irrefutable proof that you are the chosen people. The hatred of the world isn't a problem to be solved. It's a divine badge of absolute honor.
That is an utterly impenetrable psychological fortress. If you believe the world's hatred proves your divine righteousness, there is literally no diplomatic lever anyone can pull to change your behavior.
Exactly. It creates a closed ideological loop. It rationalizes the reality of endless bloody conflict, not as a catastrophic political failure of leadership, but as a sacred, holy burden that must be borne with joy. It entirely shields the believer from the anxiety of needing to compromise, from the arduous task of negotiation, or from ever having to ethically consider the perspective or the suffering of the other side.
Because giving up land would be a sin.
Right, in this theology, yielding even a single inch of the physical land isn't a pragmatic political concession for peace. It is a literal biological sin against the divine organism.
It's the ultimate absolute rejection of the small-head consumerism. The Rosh Hashanah wanted comfort and avoided grand narratives. This new ideology demands the ultimate absolute sacrifice of the individual to the grand narrative, but in return it provides something consumerism never could: absolute, unwavering cosmic certainty.
And that is the author's grim final diagnostic conclusion. As the secular consumerist center of the society rapidly hollows itself out, proving entirely unable to logically justify the massive blood and economic sacrifices required by the reality of their geopolitical situation, this absolute, unyielding religious nationalist extreme is the only ideology robust enough and fanatical enough to survive the pressure cooker of the conflict.
Wow. We have covered an immense complex landscape today, delving into the deepest mechanics of this text. Let's briefly synthesize the journey we've been on. You, the listener, asked us to unpack this highly detailed, critical Arabic source text. Through the author's eyes, we have decoded a vision of this ideology not as a triumphant, unified monolith, but as an architectural structure that is violently buckling under the weight of its own unresolved internal contradictions.
We tracked the author's argument from the outer walls to the inner core. We examined the illusion of the nuclear umbrella, the concept that a doomsday weapon cannot repair an internal societal rot.
We explored the deep, fracturing fault lines between a consumerist secular majority and an expanding religious absolutism.
We analyzed the harsh demographic realities of an ethnic pyramid and a diaspora that prefers the comfort of the West over the ideology of the homeland. And we examined the profound psychological toll of a society desperately trying to transition from ascetic founders to a Volvo video villa culture, all while still trapped within an active war zone.
And finally, we saw how the author maps the inevitable failure of that secular consumerism, arguing that its collapse paves the way for a fierce, uncompromising, and organically divine religious nationalism to take the reins.
If we synthesize all the mechanisms, the historical data points, and the sociological trends the authors laid out, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. It builds directly on the structural diagnosis we've just decoded.
Let's hear the final deduction.
If, as the text rigorously suggests, a revolutionary ideology forged entirely in the fires of survival and existential crisis structurally cannot survive the transition into peace, normalcy, and modern consumerism, does that mean the resulting society is permanently trapped in a paradox of its own making? Must the state, built fundamentally on the unifying adrenaline of an existential threat, constantly invent, provoke, or seek out new existential threats, simply to maintain its internal cohesion and delay its own inevitable structural collapse? If peace is the very thing that destroys the founder mode, can the startup ever actually afford to stop fighting?
That is a haunting structural question. A society that requires the heat of a perpetual fire simply to keep the structure from freezing and shattering from within. To you, the listener, thank you for providing such a rich, complex, and deeply challenging source text. It allowed us to truly peer into the diagnostic muddy waters and examine the architecture of a crisis. Keep analyzing the sources, keep questioning the structures around you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.